The room was thick with a silent tension that pressed down on me, heavier than any weight I had carried before. Sitting on the familiar sofa, I felt the eyes around me shift. They avoided meeting mine, as if ashamed or uncomfortable. Our living room, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a cold stage where I was invisible. It was supposed to be a celebration of my 77th birthday, a family gathering to honor years shared and memories made. But beneath forced smiles, I sensed something darker. Julia, my daughter-in-law, was there, bright and confident as always. Her laughter was sharp and hollow, a mask for the disdain I hadn't noticed before, not until tonight. Then, with a deliberate edge I had never expected, she turned to me and said, "You're nobody." The words fell like a hammer, echoing through the room and settling deep in my chest. Nobody. The sting wasn't just in what she said, but in the cold finality of it. The room fell silent, breaths held, glances exchanged. My son's face betrayed confusion, but no defense. Everyone else seemed to shrink away, unwilling to face the cruel dismissal aimed squarely at me. But I felt it, raw and burning, like a betrayal that cut closer than any wound I had known. In that instant, all the sacrifices flooded my mind. The mortgages I carried for decades, the extra shifts, the relentless hours ensuring this home was more than just walls. It was our future. I'd worked to send my son to college, to give my granddaughter opportunities I never had. Did none of this matter? Was the man who built their world truly a nobody in their eyes? The thought echoed relentlessly. My house, my home, built with my hands, my sweat. I rose quietly, refusing to give a scene to Julia's cruelty. The cold stares followed me as I left the room, retreating to the solitude of my study, the sanctuary of my life's work, blueprints, papers, reminders of every sacrifice made to build something lasting. Closing the door behind me, clarity settled over the storm of emotions. What I had endured was not merely an insult. It was a challenge to everything I stood for, an attack on my legacy. The familiar weight of years spent crafting that legacy pressed upon me, but beneath it, a new resolve began to burn. I sat at my desk, fingers tracing the wood like a lifeline, remembering the nights spent calculating, planning, persevering. Their entitlement and arrogance were a threat to all I had built. The humiliation simmered inside but did not consume me. Instead, it forged a quiet fire. I had always been patient, generous, willing to endure for family. But this was different. It was a wound aimed at the core of who I was. And though I sat alone in the dim room, the ember within me grew steadily, fueled by the knowledge that I would not be cast aside. I was nobody to them now, but I carried a history they refused to see. A history of sacrifice, of love, of steadfast determination. They had called me nothing, but I knew the truth. And in that silence, a vow took shape. I would reclaim my legacy. I would restore my worth. Tonight, the seed of resolve took root. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning they could not escape. The house was quiet when I finally allowed myself to sit back and breathe. The echoes of the evening's cruelty lingered, reverberating off the walls and embedding themselves deep in my skin. I could no longer pretend the wound was superficial. It was a fracture, one that threatened everything I had held dear. I lit the old desk lamp, its warm glow offering a fragile comfort as I settled into the chair that cradled decades of my work. Memories came unbidden, unrelenting in their clarity. I saw the young man I was, fresh out of school, eager and determined. I remembered the first day I signed the papers for this house, a modest sum then, but a promise made to my family. How I took pride in every beam and nail. calculating stress loads and reinforcements with precision born of years studying engineering. This was my creation, not just walls and a roof, but a future built on sacrifice. I recalled the nights I worked double shifts, the ache in my hands from lugging tools long past exhaustion, all so my son could grow up in a home where opportunity blossomed. I looked at the worn ledger where I meticulously tracked every spend, every loan, every penny diverted to his education and my granddaughter's college fund. These memories simmered like a low flame, painful yet vital. And yet, none of this counted tonight. Julia's words sliced through the layers of time like a scalpel. I was stripped bare, left to grapple with the bitter realization that to her, and perhaps others, I was invisible, a nobody. I thought of my son, once full of light and promise, now distant and muted. His silence during the confrontation felt like the sharpest betrayal. Had he become blinded by convenience or arrogance? I didn't know, but I knew I could not afford to be broken by it. I dug deeper into my past, searching for strength in the foundation I had laid, brick by brick. Each sacrifice stung anew. The house mortgaged for his education, the extra hours in the factory to pay for after-school programs, the stubborn refusal to complain as I swallowed long waits and skipped dinner so the family could eat better. These were acts of love disguised as labor, patient investments in their futures. Yet now they felt like debts unpaid, kindness rejected. I sat with the weight of these memories as the night thickened outside my study window. The world beyond was quiet, but inside me a storm brewed. I wrestled with my pain, allowing it to surface not as weakness, but as fuel. In that stillness, a resolve formed, not born of anger alone, but tempered by decades of reason and planning. I thought about Julia's entitlement, preserve the original language of disdain, its mother's enabling gaze that always seemed to forgive or excuse her daughter's brazen confidence. How had they come to believe they could erode what I had built without consequence? I refused to let that arrogance be unchecked. The air in the room felt charged, thick with the gravity of the moments behind and those yet to come. I opened an old file drawer, pulling out faded documents, blueprints, mortgage papers, receipts, each a testament to a lifetime of care and calculation. I spread them across the desk, tracing familiar lines and signatures, the proof of my stewardship. Amid these relics, I found clarity. This wasn't a personal slight to be endured silently. It was a challenge to be met head-on. The dignity I clung to was not simply a feeling, but a principle to be defended. I would not allow the name nobody to stick, not after everything I had poured into my family's future. A thought settled in the quiet corners of my mind. Justice could only be restored if I was willing to stand firm, to plan carefully, to act deliberately. My engineering mind, practiced in solving complex problems methodically, began sketching out possibilities, not in blueprints this time, but in strategy. I recognized that unlike structural flaws, which could be seen and repaired, the fractures within human bonds were insidious and hidden. They required careful excavation, a detective's patience. The inequality and greed that now threatened my family demanded more than confrontation. They needed exposure and dismantling. I turned over the reins to my experiences, years spent balancing ledgers, understanding the flow of money through contracts and accounts. The financial wisdom gained through managing our small investments was now my weapon. I wouldn't be blind to the tangled threads Julia and her mother wove to cover their tracks. As I sat there in the night, memories flowing like currents beneath the surface, I'ved a resolve as firm as the concrete foundations of this home. I promised myself I would confront the injustices quietly festering at our doorstep. My patience would not be mistaken for weakness. I reflected on my nature, once so patient, generous to a fault, always willing to forgive. But those days had not prepared me for this betrayal. A new version of myself was emerging, a calm, calculated force, defined not by resentment but by a methodical pursuit of fairness. I knew this path would not be easy. It meant looking at those I loved and confronting realities long ignored. It meant standing alone against arrogance wrapped in family ties. But I was ready. The fire inside me, stoked by loss and hardened by decades of responsibility, was steady now. The house, my legacy, was worth fighting for. The future I dreamed for my family, built with endless nights and sacrifices, would not be stolen by greed. In that quiet dusk, I made my silent vow. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine, not with rash anger, but with the precision of a man who knew the strength of foundations. They had called me nobody, but I was not just a man. I was the architect of their world, and soon they would learn what that truly meant. Days drifted by with a heavy stillness, the house holding its breath as if waiting for a reckoning yet to come. The steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner marked time with mechanical precision, a sound both comforting and relentless. I knew that rashness had no place here. This would be a battle of patience, wit, and calculated moves, not anger and impulse. One afternoon, in the least expected place, the narrow aisle of a grocery store, I crossed paths with Julia's mother, Mrs. Langley. The overhead lights hummed quietly, and her usually stern face softened for a brief moment. We exchanged cautious greetings, but when she let slip a casual remark about Julia's mounting debts, the weight of that information hit me like a physical blow. It was an admission hidden behind a smile, a confession masked by nonchalance, but I caught it. Those debts, carefully concealed, were far worse than I feared. That revelation sat heavy on my chest as I lay awake that night. Julia's reckless borrowing wasn't just an isolated act of irresponsibility, it was an erosion of everything I had strived to build for this family. The financial ruin it threatened wasn't a distant possibility, it was a pending reality. What cut deepest was knowing my own son ignored these warnings. When I approached him, cautious and hopeful, seeking an ally, he shut me down with cold finality. "She's my wife, Dad. You don't understand. Just drop it." Those words, sharp and dismissive, felt like a betrayal stitched into the fabric of my very existence. That night, the fractures within the family seemed to widen, the chasms more threatening than ever before. I could no longer cling to the hope of restoring what once was. The wounds ran deeper, cutting through bonds I once thought unbreakable. Yet, amid the ache, a new resolve kindled inside me. The grandfather who once endured insults with quiet dignity faded. In his place, a man was rising, one who would fight back with calculated determination. I summoned my engineering mind, tempered by years of meticulous work, to dissect the problem before me. There were no blueprints to solve this crisis, but there was strategy. My first step was to quietly seek out trusted contacts, old friends in banking and law who could help me unravel the web Julia and her mother spun. I asked subtle questions, piecing together fragments of truth hidden beneath layers of deceit. Slowly, disturbing patterns emerged. Loans tucked away in shadow accounts. Credit cards maxed beyond what was openly admitted. Transactions masked by false documents. It was exploitation, not ignorance or mistake, seeping into the family's foundation. I could see the calculated intent behind every misstep. I turned then to our financial records, examining trusts, property deeds, and bank statements with sharp scrutiny. Each paper told its own tale. Signatures that didn't match, accounts that drained without transparency, funds funneled away with alarming regularity. The family's finances weren't just tangled, they were being manipulated, stripped to serve selfish ends. Despite the turmoil swirling inside, I maintained a calm exterior during family interactions. I played the role expected of me, the beloved elder, serene and unshaken.
But beneath that surface, strategy took form, plans moving carefully into place. Julia's arrogance, once untouchable, began to show cracks as she underestimated my silent resolve. Her mother, too, displayed signs of unease behind forced smiles. News of their anxiety reached me indirectly. A terse message from Miss Langley contained veiled hints of worry and veiled warnings, a delicate dance of threats and self-preservation. I welcomed their fear as validation that the game was shifting, that the tides were turning. My son remained caught in the impossible middle, his loyalty to Julia clashing painfully with the truth I exposed. I sought private moments to reach him, to rekindle the son I once knew, but his defenses stood firm. Conversations with him ended in frustration and silence, leaving the gulf between us wider and colder. Lonely as I was in this familial battle, I pressed forward. This was no longer about wounded pride, but about preserving a legacy built on years of sacrifice. The stakes had grown beyond words. To face this, I enlisted an old family lawyer, a man whose integrity and discretion I trusted implicitly. Together, we abraded over every document and detail, mapping a path to legally sever Julia's access to misappropriated funds and prevent future exploitation. Each step was measured, precise, intended not to inflame but to dismantle malicious control. My mind worked like dismantling an unstable structure, careful not to bring down what I aimed to save. Timing was everything. To expose too soon risked losing the advantage. Delay could allow the damage to deepen. I learned to wield a different kind of strength, one born not of anger but of cold reason. The fire inside me, once a blaze of frustration, now burned steady as a beacon of focus. I reminded myself of the dreams my late wife and I once held, the hard-won future we envisioned for our children. Protecting that vision became my solemn duty, driving me through exhaustion and doubt. Daily life shifted under this new reality. Where once I found peace in ordinary moments, I now found purpose in memoranda, bank ledgers, and confidential meetings. Each detail was a tool, every fact a weapon in this quiet war. I observed Julia and her mother from afar, noting their growing desperation. The composure they once flaunted cracked, revealing vulnerability beneath. The debts loomed ever larger, casting shadows on their confident facades. A complex plan took shape in my mind. Phased legal challenges to regain control, revocations of access, exposure of their misdeeds. All had to be perfectly timed, flawlessly executed. Weeks passed in a blur of careful preparation, punctuated by moments of loneliness but strengthened by unyielding will. No longer a victim, I had become the architect of restoration and retribution. They called me nobody, but beneath that scorn was a man who had built everything they stood upon. Soon, they would learn, whether by confrontation or consequence, what it truly meant to cross the man who had laid these foundations. The early mornings became my refuge, a sanctuary where the world was still unwinding and I could think with clarity undisturbed. At my desk, framed by stacks of records and folders thick with years of family business, I was immersed in a silent war against deception, betrayal, and greed. I fingered pages marked by faded ink and stamps, each one a testament to effort stretched thin across decades. A marriage built on shared dreams, late nights spent crunching numbers, sacrifices made to build a future no one else seemed to appreciate. And yet, hidden within those carefully preserved papers were cracks, the telltale signs of fractures disguised as everyday transactions. Funds siphoned off in quiet subterfuge, loans taken without consent, expenses filed under faintly disguised names. It was a calculated betrayal, deliberate and corrosive. As an engineer, I was trained to see through layers of complexity. Where others saw chaos, I sought patterns. Where some saw obstacles, I saw problems to be solved. Now the structure I examined was intangible, not steel beams, but a network of finances and trust.
each detail crucial to the stability of what I had built. Richard, my trusted family lawyer and friend, was my collaborator in this endeavor. His steady hand balanced my fervor, his knowledge of legal intricacies essential for chipping away at the defenses Julia and her mother had raised. We scanned through documents together, tracing the money through convoluted pathways spread over banks, trusts, and corporate entities cleverly constructed to conceal their involvement. The depth of their deceit was brutal. Loans hidden beneath layers of shell companies, credit card debts buried under fabricated expenses, unauthorized transactions routed through accounts I never authorized or even knew existed. Their web was elaborate, but no deception could withstand scrutiny driven by determination and experience. These discoveries were more than financial anomalies. They revealed a lifestyle funded by entitlement, a brazen exploitation of trust that cut deeper than dollars lost. I studied their social interactions closely, too. The way Julia's voice tightened defensively whenever finances were mentioned, the furtive glances exchanged between her and her mother when others weren't looking. The veneer of confidence they upheld in public masked a fragile and desperate undercurrent. My study, long a place of peaceful reflection and work, transformed into a battleground littered with files, legal books, and ledgers charting years of misdeeds. Like Plot's structural project, I began outlining a methodical strategy to dismantle their control, piece by calculated piece. This wasn't a simple affair. It demanded a phased, precise approach. First, permanently cut Julia off from access to the family trust fund that had long served as the financial heart of our legacy. Her reckless hands draining from it with no accountability had to be restrained. Next, challenge her claims over properties and investments she'd begun maneuvering into her name. Illegal attempts to rewrite our family's financial story and exclude me from the legacy I painstakingly built. These legal battles threatened to reverberate through the family like aftershocks, but I was ready. The timing of these actions had to be perfect. Acting prematurely risked exposure, allowing Julia and her mother to hide or divert assets further, gaining new ground. Waiting too long could grant them the impunity to cause irreparable damage. Balancing this was the true test of my resolve and patience. While immersed in this hidden war, I maintained appearances. Calm and collected at family dinners and gatherings, my face a mask of benevolent patience. Julia's scorn no longer unsettled me. I saw the cracks behind her forced bravado, felt the shaky confidence beneath her mother's smiles. I was no longer a passive observer, but a silent force gaining ground. Their desperation manifested in clumsy financial maneuvers, scrambling for last-minute loans, frantic attempts to conceal fiscal disarray. Each failed cover-up was a moment I seized quietly, expanding the noose around their schemes. My son stood trapped between his loyalty to his wife and the undeniable truth I presented. I sought private conversation, hoping to reach familiar ground. But each attempt ended in disappointment, walls rising steadily between us, more difficult to scale every day. The burden of this mission was immense. The exhausting hours spent reviewing financial records, consulting legal texts, and coordinating with Richard's sharp intellect often bled into the deep night and early dawn. Yet no task was too great because the stakes were not merely financial. They were about protecting a lifetime of integrity and care. Finally, the moment arrived when Richard presented the meticulously prepared legal filings. Documents requesting to freeze Julia's access to trust funds, backed by irrefutable evidence of breach and misappropriation, were ready for submission. Signing them felt like a solemn but victorious act, a shift from silent endurance to assertive defense. In the days that followed, the house atmosphere shifted palpably. Where once there had been arrogance, now fluttered anxiety hidden beneath forced courtesies. Julia's mother sent cryptic messages brimming with veiled warnings and thinly disguised threats, but I stood unmoved. The nobody they dismissed before had become the man demanding justice.
The initial legal filings were just the first salvo in a larger campaign. I prepared for the battles ahead. Court hearings, challenges, counterclaims, all arenas where truth and falsehood would collide, and where my knowledge and calm resolve would be tested like never before. With Richard, I prepared arguments, reviewed evidence, and anticipated every tactic they might use to derail the process. The strain was intense, not only physically and mentally, but emotionally. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was the unraveling of a family, and at times I felt swallowed by the weight of loneliness and betrayal. Yet every step forward reaffirmed my commitment to my late wife's memory, to the ideals we shared, and to the legacy we created. The weeks stretched on. Each day I found renewed strength in the quiet moments. The turning of a page, the review of a line item, the receipt of a letter confirming our legal maneuvers. Behind the scenes, Julia and her mother faltered more with every attempt to mask their failings. The debts grew overt and unavoidable. The cracks widened across their once confident fronts. As the legal net tightened, I knew this path was both arduous and inevitable. They had underestimated me, failed to see the man beneath the label nobody. Underneath their scorn was a man who had laid the very foundations they now sought to obscure. Soon enough, justice would have its day. The slow, deliberate work of rebuilding, restoring, preserve the original lost. This was the blueprint I was crafting. And when the time came, they would face the reckoning they so richly deserved. The days that followed marked a slow transformation in the atmosphere of the house. Subtle at first, but growing heavier with each passing hour. The once cocky, unshakable airs of Julia and her mother began to wilt beneath a creeping anxiety, barely concealed behind forced smiles and carefully chosen words. I observed them moving through the rooms with measured steps now, their bravado replaced by a wary caution born of knowing the walls were closing in. I saw how they lowered their voices into whispers, glances darting nervously when they believed I wasn't watching. The legal freeze on Julia's access to the trust was more than just a line in the sand. It was the opening shot in a prolonged and ruthless battle, one I was prepared to see through to the end. I remember the day Richard brought me the official court confirmation. The letter crisp and heavy with authority. It was a tangible sign that the tide was finally turning. Julia's financial lifeblood, carelessly sapping our family's wealth, was now cut off. There was no celebration or triumph in that moment, only a sober sense of responsibility settling around me. This was the real fight now, one where every move counted and every misstep could have devastating consequences. The home, once a haven filled with laughter and warmth, had become the front line of a silent war. Julia confronted me quickly, her fury barely controlled when she caught me studying the ledger deep into an afternoon. Her eyes blazed, a tempest barely contained within the confines of her composed demeanor. "You think you can stop me?" she snarled, voice sharp as broken glass. "You're dancing with fire." I met her gaze without flinching, my voice calm but resolute. "I'm protecting what belongs to this family, the life I built with my own two hands." There was no room for negotiation in my tone. This was no longer about money. It was about respect, about justice. Her mother hovered nearby, a silent sentinel of threats thinly cloaked in civility. Yet beneath their defiance, I saw desperation taking root. Their attempts to shore up failing finances, frantic meetings with creditors, urgent loan applications, covert discussions, played out unintentionally in plain sight. The mechanisms of justice, which I had set in motion with care, began to clatter into action. Credit lines Julia relied upon were terminated. Investments and properties were frozen and scrutinized. Each attempt at evading accountability met with a brick wall of legal intervention. Doors that once opened for them slammed shut with resolute finality. The house's energy shifted dramatically. The once familiar warmth dissolved, replaced by cold silences and cautious conversations. Family dinners, moments once full of joy and comfort, preserved the original language of withheld words and careful glances. My son, enmeshed between loyalty to his wife and recognition of truth, withdrew into heavy silence. Seeing the conflict etched on his face was one of the hardest burdens I bore. In quiet moments, memories of my late wife's strength and hope buoyed me. Those dreams we nurtured together, of family, stability, and love, fueled my determination through the long nights and battles ahead. Every fatigue, every pang of isolation, I endured knowing the fight was for something far greater. The emotional toll was profound. More than sheer legal warfare, this was an unraveling of a family's very fabric. Yet each win, however small or delayed, restored a measure of dignity and purpose robbed by betrayal. Julia's resistance grew fiercer, but also more strangled. She sought to fragment the family with whispered lies, manipulation, and promises targeted to gain favors and undercut our efforts. But those who understood the truth closed ranks tightly around me, forming an unseen wall of support. Away from the family's eyes, Richard and I worked tirelessly. Endless hours were consumed cross-examining documents, preparing for hearings, and sharpening legal arguments. Patience became the blade with which I cut through deceit, endurance the armor I bore against setbacks and attacks. This was no rash battle. It was a careful, calculated campaign. Late one night, as I pored over financial reports and legal briefs in my study, I paused to survey the battlefield I'd created. A room filled with proof, plans, and the heavy weight of resolve. I had evolved. No longer just the patient man sidelined by insults, I had become a strategist dismantling a corruption layered beneath entitlement. Every stumble Julia and her mother suffered was a step closer to justice. I fought not with spite, but with clarity, restoring order to a broken system, rebuilding the family's foundation. Their desperation became even more evident. Denied loans, frozen assets, tarnished reputations, each blow landed with mounting certainty. Attempts to shift blame and rewrite history only highlighted how far they'd fallen. I observed them with controlled empathy. They had made choices that brought them here. This was not vengeance, it was restoration, an essential balance to right the wrong. Months passed like a slow storm. Each day introduced fresh hurdles and demands, but also fresh fuel. Life's lessons had prepared me for problems seemingly insurmountable. This battle was just another challenge demanding my best. Within the strained walls of the house, conversations grew scarce, smiles shorter. My son's silence was a painful echo of deeper familial wounds. Yet, even in brokenness, hope lingered. Not necessarily for reconciliation, but for truth to reclaim its rightful place. The role I played had transformed completely. No longer a discarded man. I was the architect of recovery and justice. Every document filed, every hearing attended, laid more bricks in the restoration of what I had lost. They called me nobody. The sting of those words was still sharp, but beneath that scorn was a man who had created the foundation, and now, with quiet confidence, I held the tools to rebuild and reclaim. The reckoning was near, steady, unyielding. And when it came, the truth they tried to bury would be revealed on the very ground I had raised, a foundation strong enough to endure the upheaval and rise again. The day the hearing finally came cast long shadows across the family I had once known. The house, so often a refuge, now thrummed with a tension thick and unrelenting. Faces I had loved and trusted assembled under a roof that no longer felt like home, but a battlefield where silence screamed louder than words. Their eyes met mine with a mixture of disbelief, guilt, anger, and, in some faint corners, reluctant recognition. I was no longer invisible. I had become a man whose time to be heard was long overdue.
The courtroom held no fans or applause, just cold, unblinking eyes and the measured cadence of law. When it was my turn to stand, I felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched to secure a future that now lay threatened. My voice did not falter. Every word was steady, deliberate, weighed with the gravity of truths long suppressed. One by one, I unfolded the evidence that spoke louder than any accusation I could voice. The debts hidden beneath layers of forgery, the unauthorized transfers diverting money into shadowed pockets, the forged signatures that betrayed trust like knives in the back. This was no accident or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate unraveling of what I had built with my own hands, brick by brick. Julia's face hardened as the evidence mounted, the fury seemingly at war with a dawning sense of exposure. Her mother sat rigid. The lines between accusation and denial blurred across a countenance once proud, now shadowed with panic. The weight of years of deceit bore heavily down upon them, visibly shrinking the might they once wielded with such boldness. My son's silence was both deafening and heartbreaking. The conflict played out in his eyes, torn between the woman he loved and the father who had sacrificed for him unconditionally. His reluctance to speak felt like a wound in itself, a casualty of the slow destruction greed had wrought on our family. Yet even in his silence, I saw the flicker of understanding, the pain of reckoning. I did not shout or rail. There was no need. The documents, the meticulous records, and the undeniable patterns of exploitation spoke for themselves. I detailed the sacrifices my wife and I had made. Families would not be built in a day, nor torn down without consequence. These tokens of devotion were no mere anecdotes, but evidence of a life dedicated to securing more than material wealth, a foundation of hope and legacy. When it was over, the court's judgment was clear and decisive. Access to the trust funds was revoked, the properties misrepresented and claimed were stripped of Julia's control, and strict legal mechanisms were set in place to ensure no future breach. The weight of justice, long delayed, finally began to press upon the wrongdoers. As I left the courtroom, relief washed over me, a quiet, resolute calm that replaced the years of simmering tension. The battle, while not yet at its end, had reached a significant and irrevocable turning point. The whispered insult, "nobody," was crushed beneath the authority of truth and law. Back at home, the silence was different, no longer tense but contemplative. I walked through rooms steeped in memory and effort, feeling both loss and hope. The relationships once trusted had fractured deeply. Healing would be slow if it came at all. Yet, the foundation I had built was intact, no longer vulnerable to deceit. Reflection brought bittersweet clarity. I was no longer the man pushed aside. I had become the architect of restitution and vindication. Each step had been arduous, marked by loneliness and pain, but fueled by an unwavering sense of duty to a legacy worth more than gold or title. The future was uncertain, shadows of broken ties cast long. Still, I clung to a vision not of vengeance, but of repair, of reclaiming not just assets, but dignity and truth. They had labeled me nobody, dismissing all I was and all I stood for. But under the weight of those words was a man who had laid the cornerstone of their existence, patiently and persistently. I held the power to rebuild, to restore, and to ensure justice was neither forgotten nor denied. This was more than a victory. It was a promise, a quiet vow to stand firm, to protect what was rightfully mine, and to emerge from shadow into light. The reckoning was just the beginning. The foundation I laid would endure, weathering storms and standing tall for generations to come. The house settled into a new kind of stillness, one I had come to cherish, though it was layered with the echoes of what had been lost. Walking its familiar halls, the weight of memory surrounded me,
not just those of joy and warmth, but of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. The family I once knew had been forever altered, fractured by betrayals too deep to mend overnight. Yet, beneath the fissures, the foundation I laid remained strong, solid enough to hold the weight of what endured. I spent quiet hours reflecting on the path that had led me here. No longer was I the man pushed aside and silenced. I had become the architect of renewal, piecing together not only the fractured remnants of family, but reclaiming the dignity stripped away by arrogance and deceit. Each step forward was hard-won, fraught with loneliness and pain,
yet underpinned by an unyielding sense of duty to a legacy that transcended material wealth. Though the future stretched ahead uncertain and shadowed by broken ties, I clung to a vision not born of vengeance but of repair, for reclaiming not just what was taken, but the very truth of who I was and what I had built. They had called me nobody, a word meant to diminish and erase all that I represented. Yet beneath that scorn was a man who had laid the cornerstone of what they now stood upon, patiently and persistently. I held the power to rebuild, to restore a family fractured and a legacy threatened, and to ensure justice was remembered, not as punishment, but as the restoration of balance. This achievement was more than a victory. It was a solemn promise, a quiet vow to stand firm, protect what was rightfully mine, and emerge into the light from the shadows cast by betrayal. The days that followed were filled with a slow, deliberate work. Healing would not come swiftly,
nor would broken bonds mend without care. But the first steps were taken. Conversations grew more tentative. Smiles, though cautious, began to return. The silence, once oppressive, now held the promise of peace, an invitation to rebuild piece by piece. I found solace in the small routines of home, the creak of floorboards beneath my feet, the soft flicker of flames in the hearth, the gentle rustling of leaves outside. These simple acts became anchors, reminders that life continued despite hardship, and that the strength of what I built could endure. In the garden we had nurtured together, spring returned with slow resilience. New buds reached eagerly towards the sun, a silent testament to endurance and renewal. It mirrored the hope I held within, that even through the harshest winters, growth and healing are possible. I spoke softly into the quiet rooms, a vow that had been my companion in darkest moments now voiced aloud. They called me nobody, I said, voice steady. But I built everything they stand on. This foundation is mine and theirs. They will see who I truly am. That reckoning cannot be denied. The transformation within me was profound. Patience and quiet endurance had given way to a steadfast conviction, a clarity forged by trials and tempered injustice. I was no longer defined by insult or neglect, but by the strength to reclaim my rightful place. Though shadows lingered, the dawn was breaking. The legacy I fought for remained, standing firm against the storms of deceit and betrayal, a testament to the unwavering power of truth, sacrifice, and resolve. As twilight deepened and the house settled into rest, I felt a peaceful certainty. The reckoning was behind me, and ahead lay the promise of new beginnings. The foundation I had laid, not just of bricks and mortar, but of principles and love, would endure, weathering storms and standing tall for generations yet to come.